Welcome to the Landscape Podcast. I'm Lindsay Chapman, and this time I'm celebrating an important milestone. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act, a groundbreaking piece of legislation that recognised the importance of everyone being able to access and enjoy naturally beautiful places. So, in celebration, we're doing not one but two special episodes of the pod. I'm so pleased to have you along because I've got really big guests, including the Chief Executive of Natural England, Marian, Spain, who tells me what ignited her passion for nature and why she feels Natural England is at a tipping point of opportunity. I'll be asking the big questions around the role Natural England's played in delivering the Act over the last 75 years, whether a piece of legislation from 1949 actually has any bearing on our future landscapes, and can our landscapes provide solutions to the nature, climate and social emergencies we're facing right now. So, where were we 75 years ago? Well, Britain was recovering from the end of the Second World War. The Labour government were promising homes fit for heroes and recognised the need for the mental and physical recovery of the nation. Key reports in the 1930s and 40s recommended access to beautiful places for everyone. And then, in 1949, the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act was passed with all-party support. It established England's national parks, national trails and national landscapes, previously of course known as areas of outstanding natural beauty, alongside the Nature Conservation Network of sites of special scientific interest and national nature reserves. Many of Natural England's roles date back to the Act and the systems and bodies it established. So I thought I'd start big and begin by speaking with the Chief Executive of Natural England, Marian, Spain. Marian, welcome to the Landscape Podcast.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's a real joy to be here.
It's fabulous to have you. Can you tell me, Marian, why the Act is so important?
It established much of what Natural England still does today. But I think it's also worth just looking back at history and the context in which that act was made. It was obviously part of the post-war legislation, and it was about rebuilding Britain and rebuilding nature and rebuilding people's access to nature. But the bit for me about the Act that rings so true today were the words that were used when the Act was introduced in Parliament. And the then Minister of the day talked about the need for everybody to be able to access nature and enjoy nature for their health and well-being. So that for me is the legacy. This is not just about looking after nature. This is about the fact that nature needs us and we need nature. And that's still true, isn't it, 75 years on?
I think one of the things, Marian, that I'm quite interested in is, what could it have been like without the Act if it hadn't have happened?
A colleague of mine frequently reminds me of protected sites, of sites of special scientific interest, of protected landscapes, our national parks and our AONBs. And while they may not be perfect, and while there's still work to do to get nature into the best possible place in those protected sites, if we hadn't looked after those very special places, both for their beauty and for their wildlife, we would have an even bigger job to do today to rebuild the nature that we need for the country to function, to support growth, to support our well-being and create jobs and opportunities.
I've had a look at the Act, Marian. It's got sections on national parks, nature conservation, public rights of way, access to open countryside and much, much more. And you were involved directly with delivering key aspects of what it set out through designating 2 national parks, weren't you? Have I got that right?
So yes, I've worked in this world for some time. I was called the head of finest landscapes. So as part of that job, I did 2 things that I will remember forever. Part of it was bringing in a piece of legislation that updated some of that act, brought in more protection for the AONBs, as they were called then, established conservation boards and required them all to have a management plan. So an evolution from the Act. But I also worked on the designation of the New Forest and the South Downs National Park. And that was challenging because those designations, like SSSIs, create an impact. They create an impact on the people that own land. They create an impact on the local authorities who had up until now been the planning authorities. So it wasn't always easy. But again, it taught me that the Act is still relevant. So the benefits of giving national park status to the South Downs and the New Forest, we've seen realised over the last few years. Those places have become better and better, better protected, better managed, better for people.
It's clear to hear that you're very proud of that work, but I just wondered if anything came out of it that sort of surprised you, anything that you weren't expecting.
2 lessons I learned from that work that are perhaps things that the Act didn't get quite right or didn't foresee. I think the Act made a distinction between wildlife designations and landscape designations, and that's perhaps not served us well over the years, that the two should go hand in hand, shouldn't they? To me, a beautiful landscape is not just beautiful because of its physical scenery, it's beautiful because of the wildlife within it. So to say that we can designate a landscape and perhaps look after its hedges and its walls and its buildings, but not also look after its wildlife. And I think also the idea that national parks were the only designation that had a duty to further recreation and enjoyment. AONBs didn't have that. And again, given that many of our AONBs are closer to where people live. So I think that's thinking about, that's what's in my mind as we think about the future. How do we make sure that we bring together the natural beauty of our countryside and our towns, the wildlife and nature, and the opportunities for everybody to access them?
That's something that really strikes a chord with me, because I think, what we want to do is say that these places are close to people and they're accessible to people as well. And sometimes the idea of a national park, something big that you have to travel to, is maybe a bit more overwhelming than something that's right on your doorstep. It brings me on to the flip side of what you've been saying there, which is, what are the benefits of the Act, for people, for nature, for wildlife, and for climate?
Many of our national parks and our AONBs, but certainly our national parks, were deliberately remote and therefore distant places. The Act talks about open places, extensive tracts of remote countryside with a sense of wildness. So by their very nature, they're not where most of the people are. So there's something about how do we enable people to benefit from national parks that perhaps aren't accessible to many people on a day-to-day basis. And how do we make sure that we bring the benefits of beauty and the joy of the countryside and the joy of wildlife and nature right into our towns and cities? That very definition of a national park means it can't be urban under the current legislation.
I think one of the words for me in the Act that really stood out was enhance, and this idea of sort of not standing still, but trying to make things better. And when I was thinking, gosh, this is 75 years old, is it still relevant for today? I thought, well, actually, yes, it is. Do you still see a relevance in it today? And I know we've touched on this already, but, where do you sit with it yourself as it was written 75 years ago?
When the Act was passed, our predecessors didn't foresee the rapid changes in agriculture that would happen in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So the landscapes changed because agriculture changed. And that was right, and that was necessarily at the time. But the idea that what we're now needing to do is almost re-establish different farming practices in some of our national parks that don't just produce food, but also provide nature, help manage climate change, have places that are easily accessible. So that enhanced word is perhaps even more relevant today when some of our national parks and some of our SSSIs have declined because of economic pressures, development pressures, and so on.
It's so interesting listening to you, Marian, and the way that you talk about it, because I really do feel that sort of people is a very important thread for you. And I'm really interested to know, though, how did you get into nature yourself? Like, what sparked it for you?
So I grew up just north of Birmingham, so was often in the Peak District for day trips and weekend visits. And we holidayed a lot in South Devon. So I spent a lot of time on Dartmoor. And I now live within North Wessex Downs National Landscape. So for me, they've been part of my life. I had the privilege of growing up being able to experience the joys of these places. And that's probably why, as you say, I'm so motivated by wanting everybody else to have that opportunity, whether they live within or near a national park or whether it's something they visit occasionally. But we also need nature where we love. And that, to me, sums up the national parks, the national nature reserves, the national landscapes. They're the places we might only go once or twice a year, but gosh, we still love them and we still need them.
And let me keep going on the big questions because I'm getting some brilliant answers back. What is your one big hope for the future? You know, what would you sort of wish your legacy to be?
So my legacy, I think, is not necessarily to change our rights of way network, but to really create the access that people need today. People being able to access green space in towns and cities and in the countryside. Maybe again, this is part of my legacy, to not be afraid to talk about beauty and the spiritual uplift, that sense of joy and wonder when we see a wonderful view, or we see a beautiful tree, or we see a colourful, bright flower or butterfly or insect, or hear a bird. Hear that beauty is part of nature. And beauty for me is one of the things why nature does us good. It lifts our souls and our hearts as well as looks after our bodies and our minds.
That's so beautiful to hear. Beauty. It's beautiful to hear because that builds connection as well, doesn't it? I always think, you know, if you don't know about something, if you're not given access to it, if you're not given an opportunity to love it, why would you care about it? You know, and we need people to care about the natural world and sort of want to make these connections. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity, you know, to talk about some of the work that Natural England is doing right now. I know you've got new designations going on and what you're proud of in the organisation.
I'm proud of all of it, actually, Lindsay. I think I'd probably pull out three that, again, go right back to the 1949 Act. We are in the first year of 5 years of creating a whole new series of national nature reserves. And they are wonderful because they are good for nature. They are wonderful because they're accessible. And the new generation of nature reserves, even more than the earlier ones, are closer and sometimes in our towns and cities. So I think that's a real landmark for us. We're making big places with lots of nature that lots of people can come to. I think the second thing is this thinking about the future of what might International Park look like in the future, what might International Landscape look like in the future. We are continuing that legacy of looking after and creating management structures for our most beautiful places. And the third thing I'm going to say is Shaun the sheep.
Well, look, Marian, if Shaun the sheep isn't, you know, the best place to end, I want to say thank you very much for your generosity and your openness talking to me. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's been joyful.
The Act was a visionary piece of legislation that created a network of protected landscapes for the nation to enjoy, and that's just as important today as it ever was. Clare Webb is a senior officer in the Access to the Outdoors team within the National Operations team. Clare, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you. And I imagine connecting people with nature can be done in a number of ways. Tell me a little bit about your role and then come on to the VIP that you look after.
Yeah, so my role is to carry out the statutory duty that Natural England have relating to the Countryside Code. So the Countryside Code did come out of the 1949 Act, so it's been around for the 75 years, and it's pretty much the same set of advice that it was 75 years ago. What's different is the way that we communicate about it, how we market it.
Tell me a little bit about your role and how these things fit into it, because I believe you've showed me this. This is the
this is the original 1951 version of the Country Code as it was then. You can just see the sort of imagery that was used. It was of the time, but the messages, you know, to do with fire, to do with litter, to do with dogs being under control, they're all in there. They're all the same sort of messages that we're talking about today. These would have been posters, probably in places like Butlins or train stations, to get the messages out.
So I'm looking at a poster here and it's got the sort of famous Thelwell cows on it and different livestock, and it's got little messages underneath. So the Countryside Code has been really in there from the very beginning when the Act was created. Where are we now with it?
Okay, so obviously times have changed, and what we've done recently with it, which all kind of kicked off from COVID, because COVID, obviously we saw a huge increase in visitors to the countryside and to our outdoor spaces. So we decided to bring forward a refresh that was due anyway on the code. So we worked with a group of 26 key stakeholders, right from your land management representatives to your user groups and everything in between. So what we ended up getting was a refreshed set of guidelines, with all 26 organisations endorsing those. So that's no mean feat. But obviously we don't want that just to sit on a shelf. What we wanted to do with it was to actually bring it to life through a campaign. A lot of the work we've done has been based through social media. That's the way that people pick up their information. So we've used influencers who we can get the messages out on their channels. These are getting messages to people who probably don't engage with Natural England or the government. And that is where 2 years ago we started to think about the idea of engaging with Aardman and engaging with Shaun the Sheep, because one of the things that we've been wanting to do is to get this into education settings. So get this out to school children and get the messages said by an influencer. And I see Shaun as one of those influencers. He's got huge followings, lots of channels, lots of opportunities to work with lots of different partners. So here's the hook for us to then talk about Countryside Code messages behind it.
And what's he like? Is he a total diva?
He doesn't say anything, actually. I was going to say he says it in a certain way, but of course Shaun doesn't, which actually means that we can use him in a really effective way, because he doesn't have a language, he doesn't have an accent. No, he's been great.
And where has he gone in terms of, it sounds like you're the shepherdess of Shaun, you've got to look after him.
Yeah, well, so lots of different ways that we're doing that. So virtually, we've got films that have been developed by Aardman, and from those digital assets, so that can be used across all types of different social media and media formats. What we've been able to do is develop resources that can be used by a huge range of organisations. So they're branded with the Countryside Code, but can be lifted, for example, by the National Trust, Ordnance Survey, wildlife trusts, and we've got about 55 organisations who are using those assets currently. What we've also been able to do is develop educational resources. So they've used Shaun as the hook, but then we get them into the classroom, we get teachers talking about the messages, but obviously all the Shaun assets are in the background. They can put one of our films on, which talks about littering, and then they can go into the classroom setting and discuss it. He is actually also physical as well. So we do have 2 Shaun statues that we've invested in as part of the campaign. They are or have been doing road trips for the last year. So this summer they've been around a lot of our national nature reserves. So those messages are all getting out there. It's very much part of a long-term behavioural change campaign. Everything we do with the code is to do with the longer term. Yes, it can make the difference shorter term, but this is not going to cure everything with immediate effect.
And I'm going to ask you about that, because obviously we're thinking back 75 years to the Act, but also looking forward, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But, in terms of the relevance today, what do you think is the relevance of the Countryside Code today? And is it as important as it was 75 years ago?
I think it's just as important, and I truly believe, I know I'm very much engaged with this work, but I truly believe it will still be here in 75 years. The code itself, there is a lot of work that's been done by partners to create linked codes. So the roots of it are within the Countryside Code, but they're able to take those messages and expand them to their users and their audiences. So I think it's really key to remember that there's lots we can do with it. We can take it into different environments. We can take it into an urban setting. It's everyone's code. We all own this code. We all have the responsibility to make sure that we're following it and understanding it. So yeah, I think it will carry on.
Let me ask you about that then, because you've brought in the physical copy here. It's wonderful to see that. Obviously the code is online now. We've got Shaun working for us as well. Can you think ahead, maybe 75 years? I mean, that's a fair old amount, isn't it? But where do you see this going? And do you think that we will still need a Countryside Code?
So I think it's really important that we keep going with this drumbeat of activity. We keep going with the messaging. We keep working with our partners who are very, very invested in it and use it and refer to it, promoting nature and promoting health and well-being and getting into the outdoors.
Well, I shall look out for Shaun the Sheep. Thank you very much. National Nature Reserves were founded by the 1949 Act, and Julie Merrett has been working across Natural England's National Nature Reserves in Wessex. Welcome to the podcast, first of all, Julie. The Act, the 1949 Act, was the founding legislation for National Nature Reserves. Tell me why they're so important.
So national nature reserves are a bit less well known than the national parks and the national trails, but they were all created by the same Act in 1949. So in layman's terms, they were established for two statutory purposes, which was nature conservation and an outdoor laboratory for scientific study. Later on, a third statutory purpose was added, and that was the quiet enjoyment of nature and open air recreation, which is really adding that people element to designation. So nature, science, people.
There you go. And now we've got the legislation bit sorted. What work is being done in Wessex to restore, and I think really importantly, enhance the natural world, and then allow people to discover these special places?
So I originally turned up at a National Nature Reserve as a visitor, and then I got involved as a volunteer. And this really inspired me to change career, and I joined the Somerset National Nature Reserve team as a worker, as a ranger on the ground. So I've been managing National Nature Reserves on the ground for about 10 years. But recently my role in Wessex has changed, and I've been involved in something really exciting, which has been the declaration of the super NNRs. So these are big landscape scale partnership national nature reserves. So we started with small areas that we were conserving really as like the jewels in the crown of the most important places for nature in the country. But that's not enough. We've now got to get bigger and bolder. So in Wessex, Purbeck Heaths in Dorset was a real trailblazer. We created a huge joined up grazing unit, and that brings dynamism to the landscape, and it creates other spaces for different species to survive. So in terms of our biodiversity, our big habitats and those rare species, you need all that going on in a landscape for them to be able to survive. You can't really pin them down just to small reserves like we did in the past. So then that led on to the declaration of the second supranational nature reserve, which is in Somerset, where I've been managing things on the ground. And there we're looking at a landscape of peat soils and salt marsh on the coast, and these are habitats that store a lot of carbon and also can help us with rising sea levels and flooding, absorbing flooding. So working across landscape with partners and unifying our voices and our actions has really taken kind of national nature reserves onto the next level.
It's fascinating to hear about it, and I sort of wonder what you think is the best thing about national nature reserves, because as you say, they maybe aren't as sort of well known as the national parks say. What's the best thing about the nature reserves?
People can get a lot of health and well-being benefits by enjoying being in nature, and it brings to life what would otherwise be a concept that Natural England and other environmental organisations are trying to talk people into. Because without nature, nature underpins everything, all our food, all our farming, everything that we do has nature underpinning it. And we're getting to a point where we need to recover nature across the country in a kind of network. And national nature reserves are really the kind of the heart of that, where we can really improve nature and then it can spill out across the countryside.
Do you have a nature reserve that's particularly important to you? It sounds like you do.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Shapwick Heath. So that's the sort of largest reserve in the Somerset wetlands, bigger landscape scale reserve now on the Somerset levels. Yeah, and that's I turned up having just moved to the area, and I went to an open day, and it was just an incredible place full of dragonflies and booming bitterns, or a type of bird that makes incredible bird song. Huge open skies, lakes, reed beds, absolutely stunning, really special place. So for me, it's been, really it's like falling in love. You fall in love with a landscape, and it really, through that experience, it really makes you understand what it's all about.
And then just taking it back to 1949, you've told us about the legislation, which it underpins all of this stuff, doesn't it? I mean, how important has that been in your job? At what point did you sort of realise that this legislation essentially underpins what you do?
Yeah, I suppose, my way in was very much sort of on the ground and on the practical level. I was probably blissfully unaware of all those sorts of things, and I was just out there, doing my job, fixing footpaths and clearing scrub or whatever. I guess as you get more into, especially with the new declarations, you get to know more about the kind of the underpinning legislation. So it's a really interesting designation because it's unique in that it covers nature, science and people, but also it's a voluntary designation. It's not something that's imposed on people. So organisations and landowners will choose to be part of it, make that positive choice that we want to manage this area for the prime purpose of nature. And also, I guess we're moving forward. Originally, when they were declared in 1949, the first ones were actually declared in 1952, alongside the Queen's coronation. And all of our national nature reserves up to this point were undertaken under Queen Elizabeth II. We've devised a sort of series called the King Series of National Nature Reserves. So they're new, all around this kind of bigger, better, more joined up, looking at ecosystems, looking at landscapes. And we're going to declare 25 over 5 years. They're all going to be part of this series. So it's a really exciting new direction for National Nature Reserves to go.
Can you tell me where any of them are?
I can indeed. So the first was declared in Lincolnshire, the Coronation Coast, in 2023. And the second one was the Mendips in Somerset, and I led that declaration as well, heavily involved here. So that's all limestone, grassland and woodland, and it's got the iconic Cheddar Gorge at its heart.
Wow.
And the last one, I think, we're 6 in now, so that was Borrowdale Rainforest up in the Lake District. Yeah, and we've got a pipeline and a plan to be declaring a lot more.
It's amazing to hear how you've come into this, and also to see your real love for what you do come out in what you talk about. And I would just like to ask you to cast your mind forward another 75 years, which, by the way, takes us to 2099, which is a scary fact. Where would you like to see this go? Because it's part of who you are, it seems. What would you like to see in terms of development?
I guess what we're trying to do now is use these little reserves that we've been safeguarding and protecting and start growing them into this network, so that we would have a really, really strong network of connected countryside that is being managed for nature and is, really that source and resource that is making us have a healthy and vibrant country where everybody can thrive. And maybe they're less known as national nature reserves, but that's actually what our country is like. We have big chunks that are used for that purpose and are enjoyed by all.
That's a beautiful vision, it really is. And if you're encouraging people to go and find their local national nature reserve, what's the one thing that you would say?
So really, I would just say, Google national nature reserves, look at the ones that are nearest your area and get exploring. Some will have websites and lots of good directions, otherwise it might be a bit more of an adventure. But yeah, you would be surprised that there's probably one near you that you've never heard of, and you'd be surprised that there are also ones in urban areas. So London, for instance, has Richmond Park, that's a national nature reserve. So go and have an explore, I would say.
Brilliant stuff, thank you. And watch out for the King series as well, because there's more coming.
Yeah.
Great to talk to you, thank you. In my career as a TV and radio presenter, I've fronted shows like Springwatch Unsprung and Costing the Earth for the BBC. And the most important thing for me, and really the reason that I do what I do, is seeing the connection between people and nature. And that was a fundamental part of why the Act was created. Natural England has played a vital role in fulfilling that ambition, and 75 years on, this year is a real time to celebrate and reflect on what's been delivered, but also to look forward and consider a vision for what can be delivered before the 150th celebrations in 2099. Yikes! And that's what I'll be talking about next time on the Landscape Podcast. Can't wait to see you then.